I used to work closing shifts at a small print shop downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my rent, and it kept my life simple. Lock the doors, shut down the machines, sweep the floor, and walk 3 blocks to the train. Same route every night. Same storefronts, same bus stops, same reflections staring back at me from dark windows. You start to notice things when you walk the same street at the same time every day, which is why I noticed it the first time it happened. It was 12:38 a.m., and the city felt hollow, the way it does after the bar's empty, but before the early commuters return. The street lights were bright enough to make everything look clean, but not bright enough to make it feel safe. I passed a closed clothing store with a huge glass window. The display mannequins were dressed in winter coats, posed like they were waiting for a train. And in the glass, I saw my reflection. Except, it wasn't just me. Behind me, in the reflection, someone stood on the sidewalk. Close. Too close. A tall figure in a dark hooded jacket, face hidden, body angled like they were leaning in to read the back of my neck. My whole body tightened. I spun around. The sidewalk behind me was empty. Not no one close. Not someone across the street. Empty. I looked back at the window. My reflection was alone. I stood there for a few seconds, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was exhaustion. A trick of the angles. A shadow lining up at the wrong moment. Then, I walked faster to the train. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, it was on the train. The car was mostly empty. A couple asleep in the corner, a woman scrolling on her phone, a man with headphones staring at nothing. The kind of quiet that feels like a library. Until you remember you're underground. Across from me was a window. Not a real window, obviously. The dark glass that reflects the inside of the car so you can see yourself. I watched the reflection absent-mindedly while the train rattled through the tunnels. Then I noticed something wrong. In the reflection, there was someone sitting beside me. In real life, the seat next to me was empty. But in the glass, a man sat there. Middle-aged, pale, wearing a heavy coat zipped right up to his chin, hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at the floor, like he was waiting for something. My mouth went dry. I leaned slightly, just enough to see the empty seat clearly. Still empty. But in the reflection, he was there. Solid, detailed, real. The worst part wasn't seeing him. The worst part was noticing that in the reflection, his hands weren't still. His fingers were twitching, like he was counting. I stood up fast enough that the woman across the aisle glanced at me. I moved to the far end of the car, closer to the doors, and stared at the floor until my stop. When I got off, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see whether the reflected man stood up too. I didn't tell anyone. How do you even phrase that? Hey, I keep seeing people only in reflections, and they aren't there when I turn around. You say that out loud, and you sound like you're either lying or losing your mind. So, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was stressed, overworked, sleep-deprived, looking too hard for patterns. Then a week later, I walked past the same clothing store window again. Same mannequins, same coats, same streetlights. This time, my reflection showed 3 people behind me. A group. A man and 2 women, all standing close together. Their faces were turned towards the street like they weren't looking at me, they were looking at something beyond me. I didn't turn around right away. I just watched. And then, the reflection changed. The 3 people stepped forward, as if they were moving toward me. At the same time, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Real footsteps. I turned, and there they were. A group of 3. Walking up the sidewalk in the exact positions I'd just seen. Same spacing, same height differences, same pace. They weren't shadow people. They were ordinary, laughing quietly, carrying shopping bags. Just late-night pedestrians. They passed me without even glancing my way. But as they did, I saw it. One of them, the man, lifted his head and stared into the store window at his own reflection. And his expression tightened, like he'd seen something he didn't like. The moment they passed, a car screamed through the intersection ahead of us, tires losing traction on the wet pavement. The driver ran the red light by a fraction of a second, missing the group only because they paused at the curb. If they'd stepped off the sidewalk when the walk sign changed, they would have been hit. I stood there, frozen, staring at the intersection where the car vanished down the street. Then I looked back at the window. In the reflection, the 3 pedestrians were still there, but now there was someone else. Behind them, a tall figure in a hooded jacket, the same one I'd seen the first night. And in the reflection, it was smiling. After that, I started testing it. I know how that sounds, like a horror movie character walking into the basement with a flashlight. But I needed to know if I was crazy. So I watched reflections deliberately. Store windows, car mirrors, office building glass, subway doors, elevator mirrors, and I discovered the pattern. The extra people in the reflections weren't random hallucinations. They were previews. They showed up minutes, sometimes hours, before they appeared in real life. And when they appeared in real life, something always happened near them. Not fatal, but always wrong. A biker swerved and wiped out the moment a reflected stranger stepped into reality. A man dropped his coffee, and the lid popped off like it had been kicked. A woman got shoved on the platform. Not hard, not enough to fall, but enough to make her stumble close to the edge as a train passed. Tiny, sharp near misses. The kind of things you'd normally forget, but I couldn't forget them, because the reflections were always one step ahead. And the hooded figure, the one that didn't belong, kept appearing behind them. Always behind them. Always just slightly closer than normal, like it was following or guiding. The first time I saw someone who looked like they were already gone, it was in a convenience store. I stopped in after work for a bottle of water. The cashier was bored, barely looking up. As I waited in line, I glanced at the security mirror in the corner, the round, convex one that shows the entire store. In it, I saw a teenager standing behind me, hands in his hoodie pocket, staring at the floor. But when I looked over my shoulder, there was no one. I stared at the mirror again. The teenager lifted his head and looked into the mirror, like he was looking at me through it. His face was gray. Not pale, gray. Like the color had been washed out of him. Then he opened his mouth and silently formed 2 words. I couldn't hear him, but I could read his lips. Don't stay. My throat tightened. I didn't buy the bottle of water. I walked out. 30 seconds later, as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I heard a crack like a gunshot. A car jumped the curb 2 storefronts down, smashing into the convenience store entrance. Glass exploded outward. The door frame collapsed. I stood there, shaking, realizing that if I'd stayed in line, I would have been standing exactly where the car hit. I looked back through the shattered front window, and in the broken glass reflections, I saw the hooded figure. Not behind me, behind the cashier. For weeks, I lived like this. I walked with my eyes trained on glass. I avoided mirrors, I avoided train windows. I started taking different routes home, thinking maybe I could outrun it. But you can't outrun reflections. They're everywhere. One night, I was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion where city lights blur and you feel like you're walking through a dream. I took the stairs down to the subway platform. The air was damp, metallic. A train was approaching in the tunnel, and wind pushed out ahead of it. I stood near a pillar, far from the edge. Across the tracks was a dark advertisement panel. Glossy, reflective, like black glass. My reflection stared back at me. Only it wasn't me. Not exactly. My reflection showed me standing on the opposite side of the platform, a place I wasn't. In the reflection, I looked wrong. My posture was stiff, my head was tilted as if I was listening for something, and behind my reflective self was the hooded figure. Its face still hidden, but its body close enough that it looked like it was about to press its hands onto my shoulders. I blinked hard. The reflected me didn't blink. It just watched. And then it lifted its hand. It pointed down the platform toward the far exit, the one I never used. My heart pounded. I looked down the platform in real life. Nothing. I looked back at the reflected ad panel. My reflection was still over there, still pointing. And now, in the reflection, a train was arriving. Only it wasn't arriving on my side. It was arriving on the opposite side, where the reflected me was standing. The tunnel wind hit harder. I heard the real train approaching my side. I understood then. The reflection wasn't showing a different angle. It was showing a different outcome. A version where I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A version where something had already gone wrong. I didn't think. I ran for the far exit. People stared. Someone yelled. I didn't care. Behind me, the train roared into the station, and as I climbed the stairs, I heard a horrible sound. Metal scraping, brakes screaming, people shouting. A man had fallen onto the tracks. Not near me, near the pillar where I'd been standing. If I'd stayed, if I'd frozen like I wanted to, I would have been right at the edge, right where bodies collide when panic hits. After that, I stopped going to work. I couldn't handle it anymore. I stayed home with the blinds closed, lights low, trying to exist in a world without reflections. But reflections find you. Because even when you don't look at them, they look at you. At 3:11 a.m., my bathroom mirror caught the glow of my hallway nightlight. I tried not to look, but my eyes drifted. And in the mirror, I saw myself standing in a place I'd never been. A long corridor with white tile, bright overhead lights, a row of metal chairs bolted to the floor. A hospital waiting room. I felt sick. I backed away from the mirror, then looked again. The reflection didn't change. I was still there, in that hospital corridor, staring at the floor. But this time, I lifted my head in the reflection, and I looked directly into my own eyes. Then, my reflected mouth moved. 3 words, clear as day. It's your turn. Behind me, behind that version of me, the hooded figure stepped forward. And for the first time, it leaned into the light. Not enough to show its face, but enough to show something else. Its hands. They were wrong. Too long, too many joints. Like a person's hands drawn from memory by something that had never had a body. It reached toward my reflected shoulders. I stumbled backward and slammed the bathroom door. My heart was racing so hard I could taste metal. I stood in my dark apartment, shaking, thinking about that hospital corridor, about the chairs, about the fluorescent lights. Then, my phone buzzed with a notification. An emergency news alert. Multi-vehicle crash on the interstate. Hospital ER experiencing surge. My brain tried to reject it, but I knew. The reflection wasn't a warning anymore. It was an address. I didn't drive. I didn't call an ambulance. I didn't go to the hospital. I stayed home. Because if the reflection was ahead, then maybe I could refuse the future by refusing to arrive there. Maybe the whole thing was about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, I stayed still. Hours passed. Morning came, and nothing happened. No accident, no sudden illness, No knock at the door. I started to feel foolish, like I'd let paranoia build into a disaster movie inside my head. That afternoon, around 4 o'clock, there was a knock. Not loud, not urgent. 3 soft taps. I froze. I didn't move. The knocks came again. 3 taps, then silence. I slowly walked to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. But as I stepped back, I caught my reflection in the peephole glass, and I saw it. Not behind me, in front of me. Standing inside my apartment, between me and the door. The hooded figure. Close enough that if it had a face, it would have been inches from mine. I couldn't breathe. I turned my head slightly. The hallway was empty. I looked back at the peephole reflection. The hooded figure was still there. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed. Not at me. At the lock. As if reminding me, it didn't need the door to open, because it was already inside the only place it had ever lived. In the thin layer of reality where reflections exist. The last thing I remember is the sound of the lock clicking. Not from my hand, from the other side. And my reflection in the peephole smiled. This has been Velvet Dread. Sleep well, if you can. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe for more stories like this, narrated by an actual human.